All right. So Dylan Rodriguez is a founding member of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association and Critical Resistance. He is a professor at UC Riverside. Riverside, he got a PhD from Berkeley in 2001 and has basically been a bit of an academic superstar in the last 20 years, turning out 3 books, including his most recent one, which is forthcoming, well, kind of already available, but technically published 2021. Anybody who's been involved in high school policy debate this year has undoubtedly come across his literature, as he might be the individually most cited author on this year's criminal justice reform topic. So without further ado, I'm really looking forward to this. Dylan, I think you have the floor to talk about your work, its relation to debate or whatever you want to, and then some kind of Q&A and conversations will follow that. And let's get rolling.
Cool. I think I'm going to give a very brief kind of contextualization of how I enter this conversation, and then I want to just get into the conversation Q&A right away, because I know how important it is to make these kind of conversations useful to y'all's work. So I'll try to be really concise here. And I did read the resolution, which I can definitely sink my teeth into. I appreciate the introduction, Kevin. I appreciate the invitation to you and Aaron. I'm a former Lincoln Douglas debater. In some ways, I will always be a Lincoln Douglas debater. One of the most gratifying things in my entire scholarly, intellectual, activist life is the fact that stuff I write is made useful to a debate community, because I actually think that high school, college debate communities are where a lot of the most incisive scholarly activist work both starts and gets sustained and rethought and reshaped. So this is praxis. What I consider the college debate scene and high school debate scene to be doing, for me, is a form of praxis at its best. And I think the way that people are engaging with these ideas is really critical. And some of the most important organizers I know have a background in debate as well. So I enter this conversation with that deep sense of appreciation and gratitude to y'all for inviting me. I'll also say that, if you look at some of what I write, I'm always interested in radically interrogating the genealogy and the episteme that grounds certain keywords that oftentimes will get taken for granted in public discourse, including in policy debate. So that's why this year's resolution is so important. I think that there's some keywords that we can spend some time taking apart and rethinking and thus kind of shattering in some hopefully productive ways the premises on which the resolution has been coined. One of these days, I'm going to try to weasel my way into one of these committees that shapes these resolutions. And I'd love to be part of a group that shapes a better one, because I feel like so much work needs to be done to rethink the premises on which the resolutions themselves are based. In other words, the terms of the debate are being shaped in a certain kind of way that leads to, I think, delimited and bullshit discourse unless you actually subject the resolution itself to a radical interrogation. So there's that. I'll say these last 8 months, I hope y'all have been relatively healthy. I hope y'all have been okay. I hope that the debate community has been able to still continue with its work despite all the limitations and all the vulnerabilities and all the illness and all the repression that's been going on. So I'm very grateful, and I'm sorry that I was late. I was actually online waiting to be let in. There's some kind of weird Zoom technological thing. So I have the rest of the evening open to you all. So I don't know if we had a scheduled time we're supposed to end, but I'm totally happy to go over that time, significantly over that time. I'm not on the clock, you all, so I'll stay as long as you need me. And with that, I'll shut up and just let you all kind of start. I know I got some kind of preliminary questions that you all were thinking about, but I'm totally open to looking at what folks are raising in chat, folks raising Q&A. If you all want to come live and ask questions live, I don't know if that's possible or not, but I'm open to any of that stuff. I'm looking forward to a conversation here. I'm really happy to be with you all.
Yeah, we already have a couple from the Q&A and from the chat, and so anybody here, please just shout it out. I don't really think if Val is here, maybe she knows how to make it so that people can actually talk and stuff. I think probably it's going to have to be restricted to the chat, unfortunately. But still, it's not, everybody can see kind of what you say. Or if you don't feel like that, you could just DM me through the chat or the Q&A function. So Sharir asks, how do you think debate is complicit in carceral logics, and how can debate challenge those logics? And I guess just kind of from the outset, I'll add, would you mind defining a term that I know you've used before, carceral logic, in that as well?
Right on. So that's a great question. I saw a flash on chat while I was briefly introducing myself just now. It probably got into my head as I was talking about my kind of critique of the way resolutions get formulated. So I think the question already answers itself in some important ways. I think it's not so much debate. I think it's the discursive and assumptive infrastructure on which debates as practices are based that tend to reproduce carceral logics. And I think I started speaking just now, and I think what we're interested in maybe doing today is responding to the second part of the question, which is how can the practice or the praxis of debate challenge the logics on which the kind of ceremony of engagement is premised on. So concrete example, and then I'll try to do my best to offer a working definition along the lines, Kevin, of the question Kevin just asked. This year's resolution, by the way, please correct me if I'm reading this, if this is wrong, but I think I cut and pasted what I think it was Aaron sent it to me. The resolution I see is as follows: the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, sentencing. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So let's think about this as an example of what is kind of being signified in the question. If we're thinking about the parameters of the debate as it's being established by the resolution, there's a couple things that should jump out at us that by the way, magnify the carceral logic of the United States of America. First of all, that the sense of historical agency, that the kind of geography and the terrain of power on which these matters of forensic science, policing, and sentencing, criminalization, incarceration, and so forth are to be engaged are on the grounds of the US federal government. Okay, so there you go. So that right off the bat, you have a very immediate way in which the terms of the debate are limited to a projected audience of the US federal government. So you've already disrupted the overwhelming historical archive of radical agency that resonates throughout every local, regional, global, indigenous and anti-colonial site by thinking that the US federal government is a reasonable place to begin to ask these questions, even if we refrain for the moment around the terms of reform, right? So I can get into that as we talk. So I'm gonna even leave alone the premise that the debate should be around criminal justice reform, a premise which I despise, which I reject. But if I'm going to be asked to debate it, I'm willing to debate that, right? I'm willing to debate that, but I'm not willing to concede that the US federal government should be granted assumptively, right, as a premise, this kind of ascendant sense of historical agency as the apparatus, the regime, the structure through which such a thing, in this case, criminal justice reform, can or should be engaged or enacted. So there's one thing, that's a carceral logic right there, right? You're talking about a logic of being encircled and entrapped within a particular institutional regime as a matter of primary power relation. That's what we mean. So that gets at, so I'll just leave that alone. So that's one example of how the terms of debate or the infrastructure, the discursive infrastructure of debate can reproduce and even magnify carceral logics. The exercise I'm trying to walk us through and that I think the question itself performs is the work of debate as a challenge to that carceral logic. Okay, so that's great. I will say then that we can think of a working definition of carceral logic, it's hard to formulate these at times because I don't want to abstract it from the specificity of historical material and geographic conditions, right? So let's call it a working definition, a living definition, rather than a kind of pure metaphysical one, because I'm not sure I believe in that in most instances. So let's think for now about carceral logic as being a relation of power, violence, and dominance that is premised on the containment of human beings, of human populations, and broader geographies that human beings influence and occupy. So it's a logic of entrapment, a logic of immobilization, if you like, right? You can say logic of immobilization if you want that, to combine that with the notion of entrapment. My late great friend and great scholar, Clyde Woods, is well known for thinking about enclosure. Right? Other scholars have written about enclosure, but Clyde's notion of enclosures is one of the most useful that I found. So thinking about the notion of enclosure as part of the way the logic of carcerality gets circulated and reformulated and refurbished and reformed and reinstituted all the time across different historical periods. So if we think about a carceral logic, we're thinking about how it is that people, places, populations, even ecologies are contained, immobilized, and trapped. And it's a relation of violence, right? So it's not just a kind of voluntary separation, right? It's not that. It's about a form of power. And you notice that I'm not limiting it to state power, because it's not always exclusively the power of the state that is generating or reproducing the carceral logic. Oftentimes it is extra state or even illicit and illegal forms, nominally illegal forms of power that enforce the carceral violence. So I think that's a start. I'll stop there, but I think I could elaborate any of those points as we keep moving forward. Oh, I think you're muted, Kevin.
Yeah, I was. Thanks. I was just kind of interested in the history of carceral logics. Do you think the carceral logics are like an omnipresent human phenomenon, or are the ones you're talking about more specific and socio-culturally contextualized?
Yeah, I would never name them as kind of universal transhistorical features of human societies. I would say to the contrary. I think carceral logics are, as I'm trying to think through them here, that they become kind of canonical, that they become global, they become universalized, not universal, but universalized in a coercive, violent way, right? So that's why I make it a verb rather than a kind of naturalizing adjective. They become universalized through this kind of ongoing half millennium of conquest, right? So I think it's the regime of conquest, the regime in particular of the trafficking of captive Africans, right? Alongside the various forms of racial colonial projects that universalize the carceral logic as the shape of what becomes modernity, right? First, it's the shape of the new, what they call the new world or civilization. And I think, forgive my use of they, it's sloppy, but I'm hoping that in this company, y'all kind of just follow me with it. So the colonizers, right? The conquistadors, the slavers, etc. The notion that the notion of power that they're premising their world destroying and world making pathways around are carceral. So and it's not merely a carceral notion of land, right? Or a carceral notion of the body and the family being property, disposable property of the slaver or the conquistador or the colonizer. It's not merely that. It's also this notion that, for example, the Christian spirituality and theology, the rise of biological science, right? The rise of rationality. All these things are imbued as well with a carceral logic, such that when we look at the rise of, for example, Darwinian evolution, right? It's one of perhaps the most notorious scientific example of how the very classification of not just human species, right, or human racial, so-called racial, ethno-racial groups, but also even all the way down to human DNA, right, to the DNA, the chromosomal, to some extent, the molecular level, are subjected to the same carceral logic, right? So it's not just about classification and rationalization, it's about hierarchizing those things. It's about isolating those things that are understood to be problematic or criminal or deviant or pathological or otherwise disposable or in need of domestication, that then reflects back the kind of preconceptual logic of carcerality that orders thought. So when we think about this, I think it's difficult to just name it as transhistorical because it's not, right? Because there's countless examples of forms of human community across these different registers that I've mentioned so far, from notions of science to notions of spirituality and theology to religion, all the rest, which are totally not carceral, which are about radical notions of capaciousness and invitation, in which think about community as an active term rather than as an exclusive incarcerating term, right? That community is actually something that one does. It's a project, right? It's a notion of how do we bring people into different forms of community. I mean, our Aboriginal and Indigenous colleagues, across the activist, scholarly, debate worlds, et cetera, they'll tell you this. There's all these different genealogies which reflect how some of the primary ways in which people who are on the other side of that civilizational project, right, with a civilization with a capital C as the oppressive project, people who are on the underside of the civilizational project had notions of community which had no familiarity with carcerality. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't also violence, notions of expulsion, notions, that notions of power and all that. That was still there. So it's not to romanticize it, but to say that the logic of power that grounds most other forms of community and notions of order, even law, that have formed, human societies in different scales across history have been not carceral. So that's why I'm not willing to concede the idea that it somehow is a natural or instinctive need of human beings to criminalize, to incarcerate, and to trap.
Do you think pre-modern empires of conquest, the Roman Empire, the Han, China, the Aztec Empire, do you think those were carceral though? And so it's kind of like humankind has been battling against this carceral logic, for a long period of time? Or do you think that there was something different, a definitive break? You said 500 years ago earlier.
I would argue that there's a particular qualitative break. I think that there's forms of carcerality that you can see surfacing in you can see in the animal world. You follow me? So you can find modalities of carcerality in different life systems. So that's it's not. I'm not so much arguing that point. I'm more arguing the point that carceral power becomes a paradigmatic preconceptual assumption of how the world must operate in a kind of compulsory way, right? In a required way, that this is, to follow Sylvia Wynter's work, that this is a requirement to reach the threshold of man with a capital M, right? That in order to be recognized as part of man, that there has to be a kind of compatibility and active commitment to that preconceptual logic of power, which is carcerality. So I think that's what I would distinguish, right? So it's not to say that, all other forms of life systems and human communities are like innocent of carcerality altogether. No, that's not what I'm saying. But in terms of thinking about carceral power, the way we're talking about it today in this context, I think it's entirely a kind of global production of the conquest period into the chattel period. And that those are the things that underlie the rise of what we have come to call in this weird universalizing way modernity. So even the terms of your question, I think, are worth revisiting, because I always remember this. Anytime folks ask questions about modernity or pre-modernity, other folks around me will say, well, which modernity are we talking about, right? Because we can think about how different peoples have produced and experienced their own modernities, which are in some ways in antagonism with, and sometimes even semi or substantially autonomous from this kind of dominant global modernity that we, again, tend to universalize. So it's messy. This shit is messy. You know what I mean? It's hard to just kind of pinpoint it in this teleological way. So I would try to push back against that and just say, let's have a good, robust conceptualization of this notion of a preconceptual and paradigmatic form of power that then gets artificially universalized, so that we meaning those of us who identify as human beings, we're subjected to that's part of logical carcerality, is our subjection to the preconceptual logic itself. right? The idea that it's inescapable. The idea that any form of human community that forms is inevitably going to fall back into the trap of criminalizing and locking people up or policing people, right? And you see it here all the time. You'll probably get it in your debates all the time, right? Especially if you try to push an abolitionist analysis, is folks say, oh, well, it's human nature to fuck people up and kill them and police them and destroy them and lock them in cages. And here's an example from this community and that community. And so you probably get it all the time. But I would say a kind of robust and rigorous definition of the term, which you're pushing me to do here, I think that's really critical, because it's no different than any other form of power, right? Like you can, well, it's not like every other form of power, but it's no different than many other forms of power where you can see it in different places, but at a certain point, quantity becomes quality, right? And when it becomes part of a global civilizational project, we're thinking about a different kind of carceral power. That's what I would push as a distinction.
So let's move on to, I think, his second question then.
Cool.
Which is a little bit more about the academic role, I think, of all of this. So he asks, how do you come to your conclusions about how the prison industrial complex is present in academic spaces? And I guess as a subcomponent of that, are there certain authors you look towards when conducting your work? So I guess, what do you think about the role of carceral logic within the academic system? How do you see your role in that? And who kind of influences you to think through that?
So a full answer to this question would require a seminar, you all. Like we could actually have it, and I'm not being facetious. Like we could actually do a seminar responding to this question, and I think one day we should, and one day I should. So I'll do my best to give like a really limited, crystallized version of a response. So, okay, so the first part of the question about how the prison industrial complex is present in academic spaces. So if we're thinking specifically about this thing we call the prison industrial complex, as that set of relatively symbiotic relationships between different institutions that constitute the prison jail detention system, from the state to the corporations that contribute to the architecture and the uniforms and the operation of these places and whatnot, all the above. Then it's an easy answer, which is to say that public universities, and to a significant extent, private universities, if that's what's calling the academy, have material connections to the prison industrial complex in many instances, because some of the furniture that students and faculty use in classrooms has some kind of connection to carceral state labor, which is a form of it's a form of rehabilitation. It's understood to be a form of rehabilitation, and it actually actively knocks days off people's sentences if they participate in the production of materials like that in certain state institutions. So there's a material connection. Now, that's not to say that is a significant part of the university in the college regime. Let's say that there's a connection there. I think more important than that is how we can think about how the academy is the origin point for the forms of criminalization, incarceration, including the prison industrial complex, that we tend to name and attribute as being the outcome of other kinds of historical forces, right? Whether it's electoral politics, whether it's collaborations between right-wing and liberal, constellations of interest and so forth. Universities and colleges have been central to the research and development of everything from the administrative authority structures, the criminological paradigms that order these places, from detention centers to jails to youth facilities to carceral sites for disabled people, mentally ill people, to prisons, state and federal prisons. The role of university research and thought in producing white papers, policy papers, in producing the ethnographic research that helps administrators and those who kind of shape these institutions actually run them is incalculable, right? So there's a long running, and it's to say that it is not a corollary relationship. It is a fundamental relationship. Angela Davis used to say this when we started doing some of the work that we were doing in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is, to the extent that we have this emergence of even abolitionist and radical work and scholarship around the prison industrial complex, in a really clear way, we're actually entering a relationship such that we are part of the prison industrial complex, even as its antagonists, right? As its abolitionists and radical antagonists. Like we're in this circuit now where we're participating in its coherence, even as we're trying to, undermine, destroy, and destroy it as we analyze. And not all of us are, by the way, right? I would hesitate to put a ratio on it, but I question how many people who would identify as academics are actually interested in abolishing that structure, right? I think that they're deeply interested in studying it, right? So if we make a subtle distinction there, which I know is blurry, and I hope it's blurrier than I think it is, then what we can say is that as a field of study, right, as a field of study that constitutes the prison industrial complex, or what people now call mass incarceration, a term that I hate, and I can talk about that later. People talk about mass incarceration.
Pretty much a whole chapter about that in your book.
Thank you. You read it. So you think about this is the outcome in significant, if not in large part, of academic work, right? Constituting these things as coherent fields of study, right? Mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, et cetera. That's over. I would say, arguably, it's overwhelmingly academic and university intellectual and pedagogical labor that has constructed these things, right? So it's not only that there's a presence, right? It's that there is a kind of mutually productive relationship between the so-called academy, and these actual technologies of captivity. The second part of the question, the authors I look toward. So that changes at times, but I'll name, instead of naming specific people, I'll name kind of fields of work. How about that? I tend to look toward what Cedric Robinson would call the Black radical tradition, in which Black feminists, Black queer, Black trans people have thoroughly engaged with and substantially, I would say, refined and proliferated as the Black radical tradition. I tend to look to the Black radical tradition to ground my work in this area. It's partly because of my own intellectual, political upbringing, so to speak, right? Like I was mentored through my undergraduate years and into my grad school years up till today by people who are part of that Black radical tradition. For what it's worth, my undergraduate degree, I have 2 undergraduate degrees. One of them is in Africana Studies, which is this kind of global Black radical position. That trajectory permeated my work even as an ethnic studies PhD student, and there was a lot of tension in that too, and it's obviously present in my written work. So I would say looking toward that tradition and looking toward different elements of it, right? So I'm not limited to either those who we would think about as kind of the working canon of Black radicals. Like I'm not limited to that. Like I rely on that, but I'm not limited to it. And I think it's important to be promiscuous in this realm, right? That we think promiscuously, that we be critical, right? Be critical. So think about it critically, but also be promiscuous in understanding how it is that our friends and colleagues are taking on this tradition, and even as they critique it, they're actually contributing to it. And I feel like, in my own ways, I am doing my best to contribute to that as well. So that I think is a principal field. I'm also deeply influenced by the long tradition of anti-colonial radicalism. And I distinguish that in a way from decolonial and definitely from post-colonial traditions, which I deeply respect and which I also read. But what I find myself most influenced by as an abolitionist, right, as somebody who's trying to fight and destroy the carceral logic, for a bunch of different reasons, I find the work, the writing, and the thought that comes out of anti-colonial moments and geographies to be the most useful to me. So I would say it's some combination of those things, right? This kind of robust Black radical, proliferating Black radical tradition.
Would that be like Biko or? Oh,
yeah. Well, I don't work with Biko as much as I would though, right? But I'm thinking, Many, Fanon, Sylvia Winter. I'm thinking these folks, right? Across that whole historical moment, but also beyond it. So I'm thinking through that. I'm thinking through those folks kind of in dialogue with each other. So I would say those are the general fields that I'm thinking through all the time.
So kind of both a Q&A question and the next question in the chat sort of are a pretty useful segue from that line of thought, which is then what constitutes the work of an abolitionist? So I guess we'll start with debate. if you have any advice for debaters. I think you just said something like, even though it's, or a little while ago, you said there's a kind of blurry distinction between those who would actually study and those who would actually do within academics. So let's say a debater reading an abolitionist critique or argument is pressed on that, and they're told, you're not actually about that life, so to speak, you're just studying it.
Right.
How would you, I guess, recommend defending or actually doing the work of abolition, as you put it?
So this is a really important question, and I understand where the challenges come from because, in 2020, for a bunch of different reasons, this kind of identity of abolitionist has a certain traction and appeal to people that it did not used to have.
Yeah, definitely.
It used to be rather repulsive to people for the last 20 years. So I think
it's actually weird to see that shift incidentally.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And we can talk about that. So I think, okay, so I would say this, if you're challenged with that question, I think number one, it's important to know or to diagnose whether it's really being asked from a place of sincerity or if it's being asked from a position of bad faith and cynicism, right? Because if it's being asked in a real way, then I can give a real answer. If it's being asked from a place of cynicism, I would say go fuck yourself for even asking that question, right? Because you want nothing to do with what I'm doing. That's what I would say. I was like, you're asking that because you're trying to challenge me based on what I do, but you want nothing to do with what I'm doing. On the other hand, if it's Kevin asking me, like, what are you really doing besides this? Because I'm trying to understand it, that's a totally different. So like, let me just say that, right? Because I think, especially in the debate context, some of these folks, they might be asking it from a totally reactionary or liberal position, in which case I think it's important to dispute where it's coming from in a real way, right? Like it's really critical to do that because anyway, I think the second part of my answer will clarify why. If it's being asked by people who are legitimately trying to grapple with what abolitionist work is, then you can get into a real answer. So I'll say this. This notion of abolitionist, let's stop thinking about it as an identity that one can simply enter once they reach a certain threshold, right? Abolitionist is an aspirational identity. It's a collective and communal identity. So I would say the most important way to kind of think about the political, cultural, artistic, aesthetic, intellectual identity of abolitionists is to identify it as part of a communal accountability, right? That you have to be in community with people, right? And here's the thing, that community, everybody in that community does not necessarily have to call themselves an abolitionist. In fact, a lot of people I'm in community with doing abolitionist shit is composed of people who don't like the term abolition, right? They'll say, I'm not an abolitionist, I'm this, I'm X, Y, or Z, or they just don't like it, which is fine. That's not the point, right? But the point, what the point actually is that if you look at the kind of the long history of how abolitionist praxis has unfolded in different geographies, in different places at different times, it's always about a collective accountability, right? That the term and the label means nothing if you are not in community with people who are grappling around the issues that you identify in your aspirational identity as an abolitionist. So if you're doing work trying to challenge, involuntary hysterectomies in a migrant detention center, right? Which is how one of my grad students do. That's why it's at the top of my mind. One of my grad students is doing work around this, right? She identifies as an abolitionist. Most of the people she works with in the advocacy field, the activism and advocacy and organizing field, they don't give a shit what abolition is. They don't know that term. They don't identify with that term, but they're in her world, in her analysis, they're doing, at the bare minimum, they are doing abolition adjacent, abolition friendly work because they're trying to straight up challenge and oppose state violence, misogynist and racist state violence, right? In an abolitionist way. They're not trying to reform it. They're saying, no, this must stop now. And we have to expose the kind of carceral and misogynist logic of the state at this site. It's abolitionist. Okay. The point being that she's doing this in accountability and in community with other people.
Do you think there's a legitimate critique of that work as, I'm sure if somebody proposed that, like, let's say as a plan in debate, somebody citing evidence from your book would probably be like, that's actually reformism. You're levying a specific demand that obfuscates the broader critique. Do you think that's a correct reading, or
it could be it just depends on the reading, because if you look, if somebody tries to pull that shit, I would say push him toward the way I try to do my reading of the Pelican Bay strikers demands, the hunger strike demands. That's such an important piece of work by the strikers. If you read the strikers demands, they're 100% what you would call reform demands. 100%. They're not even asking for fucking freedom. They're not asking for a new trial. They're asking for, healthier food, right? Better visits. The one I keep hanging on to is they want another couple photographs allowed in their stuff. These are sub-reformist. Or sorry, not reform, sub-reform. They're sub-reform demands. All right. So I would push back and say this. It depends on the reading, because depending on who one is and how one is situated and the intensity of domestic warfare violence, genocidal and proto-genocidal violence that one is facing, what we would call a reform demand is what I would actually call a survival and casualty management demand, right? It's a casualty. It is an attempt to stave off imminent humiliation, bodily disintegration and death. Okay, so there's that. Reformism is something specific, and I'm putting something in chat right now. I know y'all probably read this already, but I try to map this out in this short piece that I did for the Kaepernick collection called Abolition for the People, where there's so in the abolitionist kind of world, there's a famous saying that Ruthie Gilmore, I think, popularized among others, this notion of non-reformist reforms, which she kind of, folks got that from other places. So it's a very useful notion. What I try to push here in this piece of writing is a more clear distinction of what reformism is, the ISM, the ism of it, right? That reformism is a militant ideological and political position that limits the horizon of political work to reform. That is very different than the work of emergency casualty management, right? Emergency survival techniques that are pushing reform as part of an attempt to prevent people from getting involuntary hysterectomies or prevent people from getting executed or whatever, right? Reformism is a militant ideological commitment. Okay. Oh no, I sent it to all panelists. My bad. Yeah. I don't know how to do it. Oh, let me do it. My bad. Here, I'll do it right now.
I think I just got it for you.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I didn't notice.
Sorry about that, y'all. I'm trying to talk and cut and paste at the same time.
For sure. Yeah.
So I would just make that distinction that we have to clarify what reformism is. And so if we have that distinction, that reformism is a militant ideological political commitment to reform being the horizon of political work, that being the outermost capacity and possibility of change, that change and transformation can only come through systemic reforms that preserve the existing system. That's the problem, right? Mm-hmm. That's the problem we have to identify. And if you look at how it is that radical organizations, abolitionist organizations and others will critically engage with even endorsing certain kinds of reform, they do so with incredible hesitancy and trepidation, right? They will qualify it every step of the way. They will say, some folks will say, we're pushing for this reform to the jail healthcare system because people who have sickle cell are not getting treatment and they're dying, right? This is not the solution. People need to be decarcerated and free, but as a temporary measure because people are dying, we are pushing this, right? That's very different than a reformist measure that would say, all right, so let's actually just expand healthcare provision so that we can lock up more people and just treat them while they're in jail. Right. So I'm not saying that it's always a clear distinction. Right. But what I'm saying is that we need to identify ourselves as being antagonists of reformism and then rigorous critics and maybe even periodic advocates of certain kinds of reform, as long as it is couched within the right kind of politics, within the right kind of discursive structure. Can I give one more example that might help clarify?
For sure.
I think about this example all the time because I lived through it in the late 1990s. There's something called Proposition 21 in California in the late 1990s. And what it intended to do, essentially what it intended to do was to subject Black and brown children who were either perceived to be or in a court of law, with the district attorney, demonstrated to be gang affiliated. And the definition of gang affiliation was very broad. It would subject them to adult incarceration, right? That was the kind of the basic message of Proposition 21. So in thinking about this, the coalition that formed to oppose it reflected the kind of tensions that I'm trying to describe here, right? You had folks who were explicitly abolitionists who were pointing this out as an opportunity to not only oppose the proposition itself, but to try to proliferate an abolitionist analysis of, for lack of a better term, of gang criminalization and of adult incarceration. Now, there was that kind of general feel. There's a very small minority of us, I would argue. The vast majority of people who were in this coalition were pushing a kind of liberal and reformist line, which was to oppose this proposition because in one of the main discursive messages, one of the main kind of implicit and sometimes overt images that these folks wanted to push, what I call the reformists, the criminal justice reformists, is they wanted to push this specter of children being subjected to the sexual violence of adult men in prison. That would be the reason to oppose Prop 21, right? So if you follow that logic, that liberal and reformist logic, right? These are otherwise people who really believe that they had the best interests of criminalized kids at heart. And so our pushback was obviously that, we're against that because what you're doing is you're actually magnifying the criminalization of people, of adults who are locked up. And you are actually telling the world that not only do they belong there, but they're even more dangerous than they thought they were. Right. So what you're doing in opposing this proposition and trying to, so-called protect these kids is you're recriminalizing and effectively disposing of those who in quotes deserve to be locked up, meaning the adults. So that's the road that you walk through, or that you walk down if you kind of implicitly accept the premises of reformist logics. If that makes sense.
No, it does. So it seems like the context of like the given reform really can change the nature of your assessment of it then.
Yeah.
So actually had a question about this as well when you mentioned this a while back, and somebody asked in the Q&A, Jasmine Sidham, a debate coach at Harvard Westlake in Dartmouth. Basically, we'd like to hear more about what you meant about rethinking the fundamental premises of like a policy debate topic or resolution. And especially since you did LD debate and have some familiarity with like the general debate format, like, do you have any thoughts as to which actors would be better to focus on, or, how, if you did end up showing up to the committee, which to be honest, for the college committee would be as easy as like showing up to a Zoom call this semester.
No shit. Right. Sign me up.
Yeah, for sure. I know when it comes around, I'll actually send you the invite.
I'm not joking. I'll do it.
No, I wasn't joking either. I'll send you what kind of stuff would you like to see?
Right on. Well, first of all, let me say, Jasmine's at Dartmouth. That's awesome. I have a 17-year-old son who just committed to play baseball there. So assuming he keeps his grades up, he might be joining you over there on campus. I've been pushing him to do debate for a long time and he hasn't done it. So maybe he'll do it in college. He's a junior now. So yeah, go Dartmouth. Okay, regarding the premise. So I'm
gonna guess he's probably played against Harvard Westlake, where she's at in high school too, just because.
Yeah, I don't want to hear about Harvard Westlake. Go away, Harvard Westlake. I don't mess with the Harvard Westlake. My kid goes to a public school here in Riverside. We're like he goes to school that's the opposite of Harvard Westlake. Let's put it that way. in every good way and every bad way. So this is a great question. And actually, that's the kind of question that I would really love to see a resolution like this get turned on its head to entertain. So in terms of what actors would be better to focus on, I would say this: always look at what kind of long history of radical freedom-oriented organizing in the United States has kind of always done, which is to identify people who are already organized, right, and who are already organized at minimum outside of the state and at best against the state. Right. And these might be folks who are organized to challenge the state, maybe in reformist ways now. Right. Maybe their main form of challenge is to go to the state with demands all the time. Right. So maybe they're reform type challenges. Maybe there's a lot of reformism that guides it. But here's the thing. Something we have to, in a way, be critically sympathetic to is that the default political episteme is reformism. Right. You see it everywhere. Yeah. I mean, you have the most exciting, insurgent, rebellions of the last half century happening these last 6 months, right? And you see the speed at which those insurgencies and rebellions have been kind of disciplined. Well, there are different configurations that are trying to discipline and corral them back into reformism, right? So what you see is now the horizon is defunding the police, not police abolition. And then even those who are sympathetic with defund the police are thinking about defund the police in deeply reformist ways rather than abolitionist or abolition-friendly ways. So that's why this question is so important. So the actors, it's not only those who are already organized. So this could be folks in a faith community, right? It could be your local debate team, right? It could be a mutual aid organization. It could be a youth community group. It could be a local sports team. Like it could be any of these configurations is the actor, right? So if we think about the question, well, who are the actors? So let's demystify what a historical actor actually is. And by demystifying, all I really mean is look at the fucking historical archive, right? If you like break down the historical archive and see the background, like where people are coming from who then kind of enter the historical record as the ones who are engaged in revolutionary abolitionists and other forms of radical transformative struggle, more often than not, they're coming from ordinary and humble places, right? They're working class, they're middle class. And here's the other part that I want to emphasize. They're oftentimes incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So that's to say that, something that I and many others have pushed for a while is to think about people who are in direct confrontation with carceral state power, with genocidal and proto-genocidal carceral state power. The people in direct confrontation with that, those in general are probably going to be the places that you find some of the most radical actors. It's not universal, and sometimes folks politically, ideologically go a totally different direction, become reactionary. So I'm not universalizing, but I am saying that if you look at a certain kind of abolitionist or radical or transformative set of practices and lineages within those sites, whether it's the water protectors, whether it's I Don't Know More, whether it's Pelican Bay, whether it's somewhere else, that these communities of people who have taken it upon themselves to politicize their direct confrontation with unmediated state violence, genocidal and proto-genocidal state violence, carceral violence. I think that would be an interesting and appropriate place to focus if we're thinking about potential debate resolution. Like, okay, let's really look at that. What is it that people are thinking and saying from those places? And that would mean a different kind of scholarship and a different kind of text and climate to the way we do debate, right? It might mean decarcerating debate in a certain kind of way, and decarcerating the archive that we draw from when we do debate. Like you might have to stop reading my shit and go to my citations and start reading that instead, which I would totally be welcome to embrace. I would love to embrace that. So I think this is the beginning of an answer, but to say that too, the U.S. federal government's not an actor, right? That's a thing that we haven't even addressed. Like, let's think about that, right? Like the way the resolution is formulated, it's investing that agency in this apparatus, right? And it's not an agent, right? The U.S. federal government is not an actor. You
mean just because there's different parts to it?
Yeah, it's not the things that cohere the thing we call the U.S. federal government, right? Are a set of assumptions that mitigate against any kind of substantial change to anything, right? And by change, I mean progressive, freedom-loving change, right? It mitigates against any of that, right? It's a conquest, neoliberal, right? Capitalist, patriarchal apparatus. That's what actually coheres it. So in that sense, if we focus on that as the site, to think about even this thing we're calling criminal justice reform, we're probably going to be subscribing to old scripts that not only are insufficient to the task of what we think about as reform, but which actually ingeniously appropriate the logics and discourses of reform to create substantial change to the institutions that actually expand their power, right? Expand their punitive and incarcerating power rather than delimit or transform it.
So Thank you for that. And that definitely would be interesting to see kind of how to write a resolution along those grounds. I want to definitely address something that I have gotten a couple of questions about, and I'm sure if I were to guess, I would have guessed that this is like the topic that probably comes up the most in talks like these, or even like classes or seminars that you host, which is kind of like the more material side of abolition. And I have a couple of specific questions maybe I'll get to, but I thought Mayan asked a good question, just like to generally set this up, which is, how do you propose addressing or thinking through pragmatic critiques of the alternative to punitive justice? How do we avoid being trapped within an abstract academic critique?
Great question. I'm just writing down a quick note here.
For sure.
So here's what I would say. First of all, just as a preface, I think it's important to frame abolitionist praxis is inherently pragmatic, right? It's inherently about material outcomes, so-called what neoliberals would call deliverables, right? It's always been about that. It's always going to be that. And the kind of the critical intellectual praxis that is around everything else abolition does, it's not separate from it, right? So it's to say that everything that is pragmatic is also theorized, it's thought through, it is critically debated and engaged all the fucking time, right? So part of abolitionist praxis is actually with real intention, with a collective sense of shared intention, dissolving this artificial and I would argue generally reactionary opposition between abstraction and pragmatic outcome, right? And here's like one thing I always say to people that to think that, like, if you look at these right-wing motherfuckers that have made the world a miserable place, right? For so many of our fucking people, right? Like they actually produce new forms of misery every day in new ways. They speak and think that shit into existence. They're unapologetic about it. That's what we've seen in the last 4 years in a much more public way than most of us are accustomed to, is that these fuckers are like publicly speaking the most genocidal reactionary shit, like fascistic, martial law type stuff. They're speaking it, they have spoken it into existence, right? They're still trying now. And that's to say why that's what helps frame why the kind of return to respectable fascism under Biden and Kamala Harris, and what some of my friends call Kamala Harris, it's like that's a return to respectable forms of dominance and state violence, right? But what we've seen in the last 4 years under this administration, all over the United States and elsewhere, is a kind of this is abstract thinking that these reactionaries are doing, right? They're involved all the time. So the problem, I think, for those who identify as being the radical abolitionist, feminist, trans, etc., antagonists, the freedom-seeking antagonists of that tendency, we're so fixated on, first of all, defending ourselves from fucking death and destruction, right? So like that's immediately a pragmatic thing, right? It's like, where do I fucking hide? How do I protect myself? And how do I keep so-and-so from getting hurt, right? So I understand. I'm saying I understand it. I understand where it's coming from, right? But I'm saying that it's not a luxury to be thinking and formulating critical, theoretical, abstract discourse as we try to deliver on material outcomes. So having said that, having laid down that premise, I'll give one example that I hope can kind of shape a collective ongoing response to the question about the way Mayan put it, material solvency of alternatives to punitive justice, right? So do this. The punitive structures are almost entirely based on notions of safety and security, right? At least rhetorically, right? But the rhetoric matters because people buy that shit, right? They buy law and order. They buy the notion of the police serving the community's security and safety, right? So let's be good debaters about it and good thinkers about this, and let's seize on those terms. Let's seize on the terms that underlie and kind of rationalize, justify, and weaponize the notion of justice, and think about security and safety. If we do that in a real way, we've got our answer, right? Because what we find immediately is the main reason, the main causality behind the forms of disorder and interpersonal violence that everyone's so fucking scared of and want to call the cops to fix, even though the cops are not going to fucking fix it, right? Are forms of insecurity, that are created by this existing social, economic, racial, and gender system, right? So here's some clear ways that it's already happening, that the abolitionist deliverables are already being made. And I keep coming back to a couple organizations. I'm thinking of Ujima Medics. Let me type in, sorry, I don't have the website immediately available. You can just Google them, they'll come right up. So I had the privilege of talking to one of their co-founders as part of this freedom course that I did. It's actually on the YouTube. I'll send you all the YouTube link in a second too. But I talked to one of their co-founders back in, I think it was April. Ujima Medics, right? They come from a Black radical abolitionist tradition, a Black women's kind of spiritual and caretaking tradition. They're actually doing concrete abolitionist work every day against police state violence, against anti-Blackness. And here's what they're doing. They're focusing on two forms of care that address Black people's insecurity in the city of Chicago. The one that they've gotten the most press for is traumatic, immediate gunshot care, right? Because what their co-founders and their members realize is that there's this whole kind of like Hollywood notion that if you get shot, you're just gonna die, right? But folks who kind of are in this field of emergency care know that the vast majority of people who suffer a gunshot wound, if they're able to get medical care in time, the vast majority of people will survive the gunshot wound, right? The problem that Ujima Medics identified in the Black community of Chicago was that the care wasn't arriving, right? So it's back to Flavor Flav, Public Enemy's old song, right? That 911's a joke. 911 is a joke in Chicago for Black people, right? And they saw that, and as they put it, the state is not coming to help us, is what they were saying, right? The state is not coming to help us out. So what Ujima Medics did, they've been training people from children to elders. They've been training people in immediate emergency gunshot care. They've saved countless numbers of Black people's lives by just knowing how to take care of a gunshot wound, right? So this is immediate. This is addressing a certain form of insecurity that folks had normalized. The other thing they do that I think is somewhat less publicized, but has arguably been even more significant, is they identified a second cause of unnecessary, premature, and preventable Black death, which was asthma attacks, right? So they've done similar parallel adjoined training on how to treat people who are having acute asthma attacks. And again, saved in numerous numbers of lives by just training people on what to do if somebody's having an asthma attack. That's all stuff that is happening in confrontation with a form of state violence, which is kind of programmatic, carceral, and violent negligence, right? So there's one example, right? If folks want to talk about it, that's what replaces the kind of punitive apparatus of calling 911 and then waiting for a punitive anti-Black apparatus to somehow come and try and prevent the loss of your life. It's not going to happen, right? So what you're doing is actually addressing the insecurity. And we can go all the way on down the line. We can talk about food insecurity, housing insecurity, right? We can talk about how it is that interpersonal violence gets dealt with in ways that exacerbate the insecurities that created that violence in the first place. That to me is the immediate, pragmatic, deliverable answer. And it's at the same time, like, deeply theorized and traced into a kind of longer historical tradition. That's what empowers, I think, Ujima Medics folks to do what they do, is they see themselves as riding on a centuries old Black women's and Black radical tradition, abolitionist tradition.
So, I mean, do you think that abolition requires these kind of incremental, I don't know if I want to call them reforms, mutual aid societies, community organizations to function? I mean, you even said earlier, a lot of people that you work with may not even call themselves abolitionists. It seems like every time you refer to the pragmatic function of abolition, it is like these communities that organize effectively to deal with the failure of the state to deliver anything besides violence. Why bracket all that under abolition, or why is it necessary for you?
Yeah, well, it's because it's sort of an inductive thing, right? So I'm using a kind of an inductive logic, which is to say that, okay, so we know that in mid to late 2020, abolition's become this thing that people want to grapple with, attach themselves to, and identify with, right? And we've already kind of started gesturing to the way in which some of that shit might be artificial and superficial and opportunistic. All right, so let's put that aside. Let's put that aside.
I mean, you've been doing this since 2007 was the earliest article by you I read when I was still in high school.
Right on.
So it's like you definitely you're I don't know if I call you like an OG in this, but like that's definitely not here.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'm not that old, but I am wearing this T-shirt though with Biggie and Tupac on it. So, so it's not. So I would say this. I would challenge the notion of those things being incremental, right? I want to think about the idea of praxis here, and to say that abolition is not a historical event, right? It's not a historical event. It's not a historical outcome. Abolition is it's an analytic, and it's a method.
Okay.
Right.
Could you describe what those things mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the abolition as an analytic, what it suggests is something that y'all on the call probably already intuitively understand, which is that the existing institutions, systems, and relations are inherently violent, that they're inherently oppressive, and that they must be overturned if the people who are on the vulnerable and receiving end of those contingent and ontological forms of violence are to be liberated, right? That there's no hope for liberation or autonomy or self-determination of any kind unless those relations, institutions, and kind of forms of sociality are completely overthrown and destroyed and remade anew, with a kind of active, visioning and doing around that liberation imperative, right? So that's the analytic piece, right? And that's something that I feel was the most important pragmatic part of what I and many others were doing for the last 25 years, right? Since the late 1990s, which is, and this is the argument that I made in I don't remember when I wrote this, but somebody invited me to write something for this journal called Radical Teacher. And the argument I made at that point, which I think I'm still making right now, actually, I think I would still make it now, is that the primary method, and this gets to the method piece, the primary pragmatic method for abolitionist praxis in this kind of general historical moment is probably pedagogical, right? In other words, it's to distinguish it from other moments where it could be paramilitary, right? There's moments where abolition has had specific geographies and circumstances in which a paramilitary abolitionist mobilization was necessary and carried with it profound possibility for social transformation that was sought for liberation, right? So I'm saying it's like, let's think about the different methods through which abolition can actually play itself out as praxis. So the analytic is always there, right? So then the methodological question becomes the point of deliberation and rigorous internal consideration and debate. It could be pedagogical. Others would argue that it's aesthetic and performative. Others would argue that there might be moments where you can seize some component of the state and turn it abolitionist. And there's some folks who have tried to do that at the very local levels. I think it remains to be seen how effective that is. There's other folks who would say to seize particular kind of cultural and civil apparatuses, whether it's their faith institution, right? Whether it's their school, whether it's their college or university, right? To kind of seize a particular element of that apparatus to purpose it toward an abolitionist analytic and praxis. So it's all those things, right? So I think that's how I think about abolition in a way, because that's what it's always been. It's always been an analytic that is kind of that takes shape through a variety of different methods. And so what that helps clarify now is how the forms of everyday praxis that people are already doing might well fall into an abolitionist logic if we just name it and analyze it as such. So part of this is an analytical and reading practice, right? That and what it reflects is what to me is the best characteristic of the abolitionist lineage, which is it's a sense of radical invitation, right? It's not a kind of sectarian, vanguardist operation, which is how people want to compartmentalize it. That's not what it is, right? It's actually the opposite, right? It's to say that, we need to be in this shit together. So like, what is it that you're doing that might actually be part of what we're thinking here, right? And which will, the problem is that what we confront is a lot of alienation, right? Is the notion that abolitionists and abolition is this some kind of far left crazy thing, which maybe it is, like maybe it's all that stuff, but maybe you should be part of that far left crazy shit too, right? Because maybe that's your best choice. Maybe that's your best chance to actually like redeem some sense of like life and being.
A lot of people, certainly Afro-pessimists, critical race theorists, at least part of them would probably criticize coalitions. Do you see abolition as a coalition building project?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it could be, but see, coalition already. So I'm not saying to not do it, right? So that's where I would differ. I'd say like it's hard to do, and it's going to cause you a lot of gray hairs and stress, right? But there's particular moments where coalition might be a good tactical approach. I would just see it as tactical. That's how I would compartmentalize the work of coalition. Like I buy the critique. I'm in with the critique because 99.99999% of coalitions are premised on reproducing civil society and the order as we know it and preserving these institutions rather than like leading to their creative and wonderful and beautiful transformation and destruction, right? Like that's what most coalitions are interested in doing. So yes, I'm with the deep suspicion of it. So like, I think if one is to engage with them, it's tactical. It's a tactical decision. What I'm interested in, and this actually comes from one of the pre-questions that y'all circulated to me, this distinction between ontological violence and other forms of violence, right?
Sure.
So the reason why I think it's mandatory to have an analysis of ontological violence is that it tends to distinguish between the forms of violence that are historically and geographically contingent, right, which are kind of the outcome of really specific circumstances, right, including, and when I say geographically contingent, I don't just mean a particular land base or particular like political configuration. I also mean the geography of the body, right? There are particular geographies of the body that may be contingently targeted for carceral warfare, which in other times are not, right? Or are less so, right? Like Japanese American incarceration being a principal example, right? I know people in Asian American studies always talking about Japanese American incarceration as a kind of touchstone. And I'm like, it is a touchstone, but maybe not in the ways they want it to be, right? Because that was a contingent racial criminalization and incarceration, mass incarceration of a particular kind of body and being, right? So let's make sure we understand that in relation to other forms of criminalization and incarceration, right? They're not the same. It's a false equivalence. So, and this is where I'm getting at this coalition thing. If we have some kind of working shared delineation between the different forms of violence that constitute people's existence, right? Not just that they confront, but which actually constitute their being in the world. That's ontology, right? Now, if we have that, if we can share that, now we actually have, in my view, we have the raw material or the premises for a politics or a kind of community that is shaped by notions of collaboration, of solidarity, of abolition, of joint struggle, that is not replicating the false premises of coalition. Right, because I think the most rudimentary critique of how coalitions work is that they tend to rely on, almost by necessity, almost by conceptual necessity, coalitions tend to rely on kind of a set of false equivalences, right? Notions of shared oppression, right? Notions, and also kind of the policing against what they used in the 1990s. They used to call it, they used to police against what they called oppression Olympics, right? Like, I don't know if people still use that term now, but that's what this is, right? It's like this notion of oppression Olympics presumes that everybody's playing the same, that they're playing in the same stadium, right? So if we are able to kind of have an analysis that addresses the realm of false equivalences, which is the world we fucking live in, right? That's why I'm saying abolition is so pedagogical right now, and probably will be for quite a while, is that's part of the challenge, is to challenge the false equivalences and to think about the realm of ontological violence in whatever ways we need to translate that to other audiences that don't really give a shit about what ontology is, right? But people can certainly grasp what it means, what anti-Blackness is. We've seen that, right? We've seen a pretty widespread grappling with the notion of anti-Blackness, anti-Black violence, anti-Black, what people want to call it racism, et cetera, right? Different iterations of anti-Blackness. And I think that those things inductively are about an embrace of this ontological dimension of anti-Blackness, which is different. It's different from what many other communities that are subjected to racial and racist state violence confront, right? Once we have that layer of distinction, we can actually work in abolitionist collaboration, solidarity, et cetera. And to me, that's different than coalition.
So, I mean, I guess just like a clarification question about the ontological thing. You mentioned something about geographical specificity. I mean, maybe I'm just misunderstanding what you mean here. It seems like all violence to anyone ever has to have a specific geographic and social context. Are all different types of violence or all individual acts of violence then ontologically distinct from one another? Or do you mean something else by ontology then?
Well, I'm thinking about I'm thinking about a particular kind of violence, which is ontological violence, right? Like a violence of how one comes into being or non-being.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm thinking about that register of violence, right? About the register, people in Africana and Black studies have long talked about that, right? Like Fanon famously talked about it, right? So I know that the folks' reference point nowadays is Afro-pessimist writing, and of course, if you look at citationally what my colleagues and friends in Afro-pessimism are citing, they're citing this long canon
Sure.
of Black radical thought, and so that ontological violence that Fanon writes about, for example, and Sylvia Wynter writes about, for Wynter, it's about how it is that Black being and Indigenous or Aboriginal being come into being in the civilizational text, right? That the way in come into kind of non-being, really, right? And that's where she's in dialogue with Fanon. So that's an ontological violence, right? Like to be coming into sociality as a non-being, and therefore as someone who's already disqualified from sociality as they enter it, is a particular layer of violence that then manifests and it gets institutionalized and gets weaponized in all kind of different ways, including in this case in 2020, police violence, anti-Black police violence, right? So I'm getting at that. I'm saying if we think about that register alongside in a collegial, collaborative, and radically mobilized way, alongside other kinds of violence, which might not be ontological, right? They might be what people call systemic, right? They might be contingent. They might even be, for lack of a better term, they might be fleeting and temporary in a kind of historical way, right? It's not to dismiss them. It's not to say that they're not grave. They're not saying that it's none of that, right? But in a non-judgmental way, in a descriptive and analytical way, if we think about these different layers of violence in a rigorous way, I think now you have the premises for the kind of a collective, mobilization, community building, organizing, if you want to call it activism, call it that, or even thought, that's going to be more careful, and that's going to be able to kind of confront these layered systems of violence and dominance much more effectively than coalitions which reproduce false equivalences. So I don't know if that answered your question, though, Kevin.
It did.
Okay.
Do you see abolition as part of like Fanon's process of erecting a new humanism?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean that's what I come back to, and I think a lot of us that try to think abolition all the time, we come back to it all the time, which is the idea that it depends who I'm talking to, of course, right? But like for some folks, what I'll say is that I'll repeat Fanon's line about how the modern world, or the first, was the creation of the so-called third world. So what you need is not even, it's like the whole way that like the United Nations or the World Bank or other neoliberal apparatuses will raise the question of how do we help the global south or the underdeveloped world or the third world or Africa or whoever it might be. It's the wrong question, right? It's about reparation in the most radical interpretation of the word reparation, right? And that's what Fanon gets at. So yeah, so I mean that's just one piece of it, but yeah, I would keep coming back to it.
Would you characterize any forms of violence besides anti-Blackness or settler colonialism in the contemporary condition as ontological?
That's a great question. I think it's an argument I'd be willing to have with people. Yes. Okay. So I think one, and I'm thinking about folks who are writing about the ontology of the terrorist, for example, right? Now, I think I would still have beef with a certain way that gets articulated and played out into the kind of, it gets pushed into this terrain of false equivalences again, right? So I'm going to push back against that every time, right? But to the extent that we think about how ontology is not kind of reified and situated at one particular historical moment, but like, ontology can be something that is produced by a particular configuration of dominance, war and violence. I think that would be like, for example, the way some of the most nuanced and radical thinking among Palestinian scholars, Palestinian liberationist thinkers and so forth, the way they're thinking in the realm of ontology, or at least the ontological, is very interesting and very careful, like at its best, very careful. So even the way that field adjacent in conversation with people that are doing work around indigeneity and indigenous self-determination against settler colonialism, and people that are doing Black radical, Black liberationist, Black freedom struggle kind of oriented stuff, those sets of conversations, I think, are oriented by the ontological, right? And it kind of rethinks the temporality of it. So I think it's a brilliant question you just asked, by the way. Like, part of the challenge is rethinking the temporality of ontological violence. Yeah. So I think that's a conversation I would be willing to have all day and every day.
So we just had a question in the chat, I think as a jumping off point as well. Schreier asked, would abolitionists disagree with Charles Mills' concept of radical liberalism and using the state to create more equal solutions? What do you think of Mills and radical liberalism?
I think it would be a debate. I think that's like a vigorous debate, because if you see, and this is what's interesting, if you look at the field of people who are engaged with abolitionist work, this is what I'm saying. It's not really a coalition. It's like, it's messy, right? It's this messy group of folks that are doing different shit. You have folks who are anarchists, right? So like the whole notion of, inhabiting, occupying, or even appropriating the state is anathema to that conceptualization of abolition. You have other folks who are not necessarily anarchists, but, and this is what I'm, what I try to be as adjoined with as possible is, folks that are in a kind of Black radical and anti-colonial tradition are at most generous, deeply suspicious of any tactic that advocates, a kind of use or occupation or inhabitation of the state, right? I think a kind of counterintelligence inhabitation of the state. Y'all probably know that old film, Spook Who Sat by the Door, the classic one, right? Where, black petty bourgeoisie dude ends up infiltrating the CIA as part of the Black Revolution. Like, that's the most, I think I'd be willing to go, is like following that parable, right? Mm. I think that you're going to have a fight. There's other folks, now, to be fair, there's other folks who are equally rigorous, equally radical abolitionist thinkers who would be much more, I think, generous and maybe even creative about how they would aspire to occupy or inhabit certain kinds of state apparatuses. And I could be convinced to be, at least temporarily, in line with that. Like, if people give me a convincing scenario, like, I might be convinced to support that, right? But it's always with the notion that, like, we're gonna abandon ship as soon as that tactic turns into liberalism, right? So I think by and large there's going to be an argument with Mills on that part of it. But in terms of the kind of the tactical use of the state, there might be some like modest contributions that Mills's thought could make to equip that. But like folks aren't necessarily reading Mills.
So for all these tactics, for you, they're all in service of a strategy. I'm not mischaracterizing it to say that strategy is tangible police and prison abolition.
Yeah, and people forget that nowadays, by the way, right? Even with police abolition, it's like folks forget that one of the principal commitments here is the abolition of incarceration.
No, exactly right. Get rid of prisons.
Yeah.
So just to get back to what one person asked about the material aspect of that, I think the abolition end goal definitely attracts people these days, but it scares others off as well. What do you say to people who are like, well, some people are incorrigible, and how are you going to deal with them in terms of just like their inclination, your sociopaths or what have you? Yeah. Great question. And one of the mantras I've been repeating over and over again, and encouraging other people to repeat over and over again is this: abolition is not an outcome. It's not. It is not an outcome. Abolition is not an end goal. Abolition is an everyday vision. It's an everyday form of creativity. It's an everyday method, right? So one is building abolitionist creativity and abolitionist relationship and abolitionist community every single day. That's what you do. That makes it a lot less scary for folks, right? If they think about it in those terms, that we're not trying to reach some kind of mystified end goal that we're not going to live. We're not going to live to see it. It's like bullshit. No, we actually live to see it right now. And it's in kind of rethinking and regenerating. And I'm talking about stuff that is entirely under people's immediate agency to shape. So it's not because part of the danger of thinking about abolition as an end goal or an objective or an outcome is it defers, in my view anyways, it defers the urgency, right? It defers the sense of responsibility and accountability, right? On the other hand, if we think about abolition as a constant form of collective creative genius, which is what you look at Ujima Medics, that is collective and creative genius, what they are doing, right? Like that's what that is. And if you think about that as one example, if you think now you can proliferate if you look at the Pelican Bay hunger strike, another great example, right? These are people who are in the security housing unit. They're under lockdown, essentially 24 hours a day.
They are not allowed human contact other than when they are cavity searched and sexually assaulted by guards. They only get to leave their cells for about an hour a week, right? And yet part of their work was to organize a mass, what turned into a California-wide and to some extent a national hunger strike, despite, not even despite and because of the conditions of their incarceration, right? That's abolitionist struggle right there, right? That's abolitionist struggle right there. Like, they are completely overturning the logic of isolation, incarceration that they are subjected to on everyday level. That's what I'm thinking about, right? That's what abolition actually looks like right now, pragmatically in the present, is that kind of organizing. And my point in raising that is, if the people in security housing units in Pelican Bay can engage in that form of collective and creative genius, right? That form of abolitionist collective and creative genius, then it should be instructive to all the rest of the people who want to think about this question, that they not only can do it, but we're probably obligated to do it, right? We're probably obligated to think about what that collective genius would look like where we are, and, in the circles we move in.
So do you think it's just like less important to debate about the hypothetical world of no prison or police, just because we're so far from it?
Yeah, I think that's actually not very important. I know that. So I want to say that respectfully, because I know that there's some political education curricula that are very productive because they encourage people, like in these kind of small controlled group settings, to imagine that world, right? Like, well, so I'm not putting that down at all. So like, I don't want to get twisted and like say, I actually think that's a productive collective exercise, primarily because in doing that visioning, people start to see how they're already doing it, right? How they're already involved in practices, collective practices that anticipate, or even like at a different scale, enact this kind of grandiose thing that they're envisioning as the world beyond police and prisons, right? That's part of that pedagogical exercise, right? So when I say I don't think it's useful, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the notion of deferring the present tense of abolition as creative, collective, community, and genius, in favor of this kind of mystified afterward, this mystified outcome, right? I think that's not what we're talking about. It's not, because in part because if we follow the kind of history of revolt, revolution, and revolutionary struggle, the reason it's not worth it is because you actually have no idea until it happens what the transformative possibilities are until they're in front of you, right? Sure. And I would argue we're in a moment that's like that right now, right? And I'm just hoping that folks don't concede it to reformist agendas, reformist ideologies, and reformist discipline, right? Which is carceral. I'm hoping that we recognize it as being, in many ways, a really critical period that we're in right now and can actually embrace.
So for you, in order to avoid replicating carceral logics, does revolutionary struggle have to be gradual and kind of over a long durée, so to speak? Or
that's a great question. I'm not sure about the temporality of it, because I also see moments of insurgency, like intensified insurgency, like the one that we've been part of these last I don't know, 6 months or so, maybe a little more than 6 months now. I see that as being a critical constituent of this kind of long abolitionist struggle. So I don't want to compartmentalize or even artificially perpetualize the temporality of it. Maybe we can think about it instead as different intensities. How about that? Right? Let's think about abolition as a kind of, it is a longue durée, right? Like it's a perpetual analytic, a perpetual method, a perpetual, modality of building community and creative collective genius. But let's think about that perpetuality as being uneven, maybe at times asymmetrical, both in terms of the intensity of struggle and in the geographies of struggle, right? Maybe there's particular places where the struggle has to be hyper intense, and which we need to try to find ways to contribute, enable, and proliferate it, right? Maybe there's other ways in which, other times and moments and spaces in which it doesn't look like that, right? Maybe it's a kind of low intensity formation of abolitionist work. And these things can coexist by necessity.
Are there any, especially kind of more contemporary or relatively recent, either revolutionary or like general political struggles that you take influence from, that you'd characterize as probably revolutionary in scope, as opposed to, say, I forgot exactly how you phrased the prison hunger strike demands, I think as like a survivalist method of reform. Are there any revolutionary projects that you take particular optimism from?
Yeah, especially to the extent that it challenges me to think more capaciously about that term, meaning the term revolution or revolutionary, right? So if I can come back real quick to the Pelican Bay hunger strike example, then I'll think about a couple other examples.
Sure.
What's interesting to me about the Pelican Bay hunger strike, which the strikers would argue it has never ended, right? That it's like been reiterated multiple times since over the last almost decade.
Right. It's like broken with force feeding and the like, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. No, and then the strikes will like reiterate with intensity in certain moments. Like folks will just announce a strike and then boom, it's on again, right? So it's been multiple phases of the hunger strike, and like it's just a matter of time before there's another one, right? So I think about that as an example. The demands are not what one would call revolutionary, right? But let's make a distinction between revolutionary as a kind of political program that's relatively coherent and identifiable in the kind of classical sense of revolutionary, right? Mm-hmm. And let's distinguish between that, right, revolutionary program versus an abolitionist and or revolutionary logic of insurgency, right? That you can have a logic, you can have a revolutionary logic that is, for lack of a better term, I got to think of a better term than this, but for lack of a better term, that is kind of hiding behind what seem to be reform demands. Right. That's what I would argue was happening with the Pelican Bay hunger strike, is that there was a revolutionary logic of unapologetic insurgency and opposition to the coherence and the integrity of the carceral state that was in the hunger strike. Right. That's what the hunger strike actually enacted, was that kind of unapologetic radical opposition and confrontation. And the demands were just a glimmer of it. Right. But if you even read the demands closely, they're being performed in the way the demands were also phrased. Right. Because what they were testifying to is like, we're making these demands from a condition of carceral genocide. So the reason why our demands are, from somebody else's reading would seem so moderate, right, would seem so humble, is because we're in such a condition of living death that this is the most that we can actually conceive of right now. Right. So it actually exposes the logic that they're confronting. To me, there's a revolutionary or abolitionist logic to that. Right. Is it exposes, it demystifies, it melts away the kind of veneer of the law and order carceral state. So there's that piece. Let me think as well about the struggle, Mauna Kea, right, in Hawaii right now. So folks are trying to protect the sacred site from basically invasion by a certain kind of university, academic, corporate, scientific community, right? So let's think about the logic behind that protection as being revolutionary in its logic, or at least anti-colonial in its logic. I would argue it's abolitionist in its logic. I mean, that's an ongoing conversation with indigenous Aboriginal people, right? It's kind of the relation between decoloniality, anti-colonialism, indigenous self-determination, and abolition, right? So I think it's a very healthy and good conversation, but it's a complex one. But if you think about that confrontation, I saw this play out in a really interesting way because I was for 4 years, I was the UC-Riverside Academic Senate Chair. So I had to go to these system-wide, University of California system-wide Senate meetings. And this was a point of debate in a couple of the system-wide Senate meetings. And what you saw was that what the protectors are actually doing at Mauna Kea, it's not just a resistance to a fucked up occupation and destruction of ancestral, spiritual, sacred land. It's not just that. It's actually an epistemic challenge to the notions of academy and science, right? And that's what pissed off the scientists, right? Because these scientists who are otherwise kind of these good liberal folks who would take good liberal positions all the time, the moment in which you had the indigenous people saying, fuck you with your science, right? Your science is a manifestation of this kind of settler colonial cultural genocide, and you're destroying the ecology. And not only that, we have our own science, which is completely separate and autonomous of your science, right? What you saw was a kind of antagonism, a demystifying antagonism that brought to the surface these epistemic alienations that normally get completely normal, that are normalized. They're usually completely normalized, right? To the point where like they're taken as natural. So now what you had was a science kind of, the astronomers and so forth, right? But you had a scientific community that had to defend itself as such, right? They had to defend the science, and they couldn't. That's my point. right? Is they actually couldn't.
Yeah.
So there was something really profound in like anti-colonial, if not revolutionary, and certainly anti-colonial in that confrontation. And the only defense I heard was from one person that was on one of the calls who was there as like a substitute for somebody who couldn't make the call. And I know that they got shushed and driven out of there later. But the only person from the scientific community that spoke in real kind of bare terms to the confrontation was somebody who they trotted out all of like the anti-indigenous, anti-Indian stereotypes. In this, and this is, I was kind of blown. I was like, wow, this person's like, they're coming with it. They were saying, we as scientists should not have to concede our projects to this kind of pre-modern tribal sensibility. Like they were doing that whole line, that whole script that you would say. But I'm saying that's the only person that was the defense. That was the most strident defense I saw of that particular project. So like, let's think about that, right? And I could go on down the line, but let me I'll just offer those two examples, right? The ongoing carceral hunger strikes in Pelican Bay and elsewhere, and then the land protectors in Mauna Kea. Yeah,
for sure. And I know for anyone, I'll just kind of plug your book for you. You basically have a long chapter about Mauna Kea, I believe, and then also kind of about Pelican Bay. So I know you've written about these extensively, which is really cool. The next couple of questions have just come in. Sorry for taking so long to get to your questions because all of our conversations last so long. So a debater from Minneapolis South asked, to go back to an earlier point about capital C civilization, why do the logics of conquest and domination that played out in that specific material manner, chattel slavery from Africa specifically, and the resource extraction in America, why do you think those have become so enduring and, ontological, perhaps, if that wasn't the word used in the question?
Yeah. Well, I think in a nutshell, and here I'm writing, by the way, this is all a synthesis of all the people that I've read over the years, right? So none of this is original thought in any way, shape, or form. I don't want anyone to get that twisted. But it is an attempt to kind of synthesize a response from that archive to this important question. So first is to think about, if we're going to think about the way the question's phrased, right? The logics of conquest and domination, we need to think about that as a historical continuity, right? So I would make a subtle but important challenge to the way the question's phrased as played out, right? Played out is in past tense, right? I think there is a historicity and a continuity to it that is important to understanding the present tense and futurity, right? So that would be the first way I would try to break this, not break down the question, but break down my answer to it, right? So my answer to the question is say that the logics of conquest and domination are about, if we can think about it as a narrative script, or a narrative framework, not a script, a narrative framework for how civilization is supposed to happen, like the telos of civilization, which gets disrupted all the time and people resist it all the time and whatnot, right? But it doesn't actually displace the narrative itself, right? The narrative is so persistent and so oppressive and so violent, right? That's the thing that's hard to get at, is the narrative of civilization. So let's think about how the logics of conquest and domination have a certain kind of resiliency to them as logics, and that they have a continuity to them as logics. All right. So if we think about it in that way, then I think it begins to answer the question coherently. Because if we understand that the kind of onset of this half millennial project of civilization required a certain intensification of conquest and movement, of occupation, of expropriation of land and being, of destruction of land and being and culture and so forth. Like that was an intensification that established the kind of material global premises for the actualization of the civilizational project as a successful project, right? That is for civilization to actually exist as such. Those intensities of violence had to be kind of experimented and executed in an ongoing, intensified way over several hundred years, like give or take 300, 350 years, maybe more, depending on how one calculates in terms of the certain kind of intensity, in such a way that becomes the premise of civilization. And then what happens, as with any form of intensified violence, is once the civilizational project decides to call it quits on those forms of intensified violence, it's not like it's not like the violence just stops or goes away, right? That's the perpetuity and continuity that I think we always have to think about. That's what a carceral logic is, right? Like you could abolish prisons, jails, and detention centers next year. We can abolish cops off our campuses next year. And the thing that has to follow in the wake of that abolition is a heightened, rigorous analytical attention to how carceral and policing logics are still playing themselves out in the absence of prisons, police detention centers, and jails, right? So that's what I'm getting at in response to this question, that these logics outlive their institutionalities. Mm-hmm. That's the point. That's the perpetuity we're talking about. So that's the importance of what Black radicalism and Black study has contributed, is to think about these forms of anti-Black subjection. They outlive their particular institutionalities, right? So they outlive the institution of plantation chattel slavery. They outlive, anti-Black apartheid. They outlive each kind of institutional and systemic phase, because it's the logic that matters. It's the logic that forms the premise of coherence for the civilizational social world. And it's not exclusive. It's not the only one, but I'm saying if we think about that, because it was raised in this question, if we think about that, then we have to trace the continuity of it. That's what I would call, a certain kind of genealogy, an exercise in genealogy, is to kind of track those shifts, track that perpetuity, because what you're looking at is continuity rather than a kind of past tense versus a present tense. So that's a kind of short, crystallized answer, but we could talk a lot more about that one day.
Sure. So the next question was basically, how wary should we be of engaging in incremental forms of resistance by voting for Democrats to Republicans, or by fighting for minute policing bills?
Yeah, I don't even see these things as forms of resistance for the most part. I mean, it could be like, I have some dear friends and even mentors and teachers that they'll ride Bernie Sanders all day and all night. Like, I could maybe be convinced to vote for Bernie or something, maybe. Like, I can't say, I have not voted, by the way, just full transparency, I have not voted for one of the two-party candidates in any presidential election since I was, allowed to vote, right? I usually fill in somebody who, be a third-party candidate, or I'll fill in somebody who's a historical figure who was destroyed by the state. Like, that's who I vote for these positions, just because, also because it doesn't fucking matter, because the way the electoral college works. So I think
you vote in local elections.
Yeah, I do. I will. I'll vote for proposition. I'll vote for and against propositions. Like, I'll kind of follow the analysis of some of the organizations I trust on some of these things. So I'll do that, because there's certain, at least kind of direct counting that happens with some of that stuff. So I'll do that. Every now and then at the local level, there might be somebody who runs for city council position who I know and I trust, and I know that they're not invested in a career in electoral politics. And I'm like, okay, if they can get more funding for K-12 education over here in Riverside, that gets some of the kids of undocumented families and first language learners and, working class Black families more funding, cool, I'll vote for them for city council. So I'll that stuff I'm willing to do, right? But in terms of the big capital D Democrat, capital R Republican that this question's raising, I actually think that it's the ceremony itself is the violence. I would draw a rough analogy to the ceremony. I'm thinking about the campaign I'm involved with, this Cop Stop Campus campaign, which is this background that I have here. And one of the debates that we're having right now, in which I'm engaging with, in a really robust way, is around the emergence and I think nationwide proliferation of university administrative task forces on policing. Right? They're like all these reform, community, student-facing, public-facing task forces on policing and police reform and blah, 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 blah. And I'm saying the same thing about that, which is that it's the very existence of the task forces that accomplishes their purpose. It doesn't matter what they actually do or don't do, right? They're almost all designed to do nothing. Well, that's number one, right? But it doesn't even matter whether they create good or bad recommendations. It's the very existence of the task force that legitimates the presence of the police to begin with and to end with, right? That's the premise. It's no different than what we think about in the kind of broad sense of electoral politics. It's the ceremony of the electoral action that legitimates the system. Now, there again, dear friends of mine, mentors and teachers of mine, like they debate how it is that sometimes forms of political organizing that happen around electoral campaigns, supporting particular kinds of Democrats can enable broader social movements, broader grassroots struggles, broader radical stuff. Okay, so like I can listen to that. It doesn't make me any more comfortable with it because I don't like the ceremony of it. I don't like what the ceremony accomplishes in and of itself. But I'll also say that in terms of policing bills, to the extent that police reforms are never actually accountable, really, to anybody, to any body, that is, right? They're really never accountable to any body. You might have community civilian review boards, but like, I co-authored something a while back with some well-known people like Miriam Kaba and Beth Ritchie and others that talked about how there's these layers of problems with community police review boards, right? And what they end up doing is relegitimating the existence of the police. So I think what we need to be careful of, and what we need to maybe speak to and address and write back to and think about and debate more proactively, is the ceremony of it, right? The ceremony of these things. Like let's shit on this. Like even like, in other words, if we're going to engage in some of these, short-term things, campaigns or otherwise, let's at the very least, let us all shit on the ceremony as we participate in it.
Sure. All right, so I've tried to answer everything that people have put out so far. So if you have something that you don't think was answered or that I missed, or just something else that you haven't asked yet, now's the time. In the interim, I'll ask one more question, and this could be our last one, depending on what people say. Basically, in the last year or so, what would you say the most illuminating or profound piece of scholarship you've encountered has been, especially given COVID and everything?
Oh, I'll tell y'all. I'm cheating a little bit in saying this, but if you look at that link, which I self-indulgently put to my own contribution to that collection that Colin did with Medium, that Abolition for the People series, that series has blown my mind. That series, it's like, I think it's about 30 different contributions. They're all short. They're all like super duper useful in different kinds of settings, like organizing settings, classroom settings, debate settings, et cetera. Like that project and the people that were gathered to make these kind of short contributions has stayed with me. And I think it'll stay with me for a really long time. So I think that piece, and then, so I'm already cheating saying that because that's like 30 different people. It's not one thing, but it's 30 people, but it's one collection. So it's kind of cheating. The other thing I think would be, and I'll try to give you all a link to it right now. The other thing that stayed with me, as you can probably tell, because I was citing them, is this conversation that I had with a group of folks representing Ujima Medics, the Dream Defenders, Miriam Kaba, Dean Spade, around abolition and mutual aid, as part of the American Studies Association's Freedom Courses series. So I'll pull up a link to that. Hold on, I'll do that right now. I'll give you all a link to the entire series, not just that one particular session, but I'm gonna do it right now. Sorry, I'm just pulling it up. Sorry. Anyway. So again, I'm kind of cheating, giving you two things, and one of them involved like 30 short pieces. But that's the stuff that's been with me a lot in the last year or so.
So we actually did have one more question, which was, I think, a follow-up from the one about civilization. So I'll just read it. Sorry, I asked my question wrong. What do you think made civilization so violent, and what specific material or immaterial things caused the shift to carceral logic? Like, what put civilization on the trajectory towards ontological violence? Yeah, it's so this is what I'm kind of like trying to grapple with in the book that I just published. It's the production of being, like what I call white being, right? The production of white being, that's what's created this kind of durable, malleable, and persistent violence. It's how it is. And I was inspired to try to get at this through Fanon's work, Sylvia Winter's work, and other folks' work, right? Because what they're grappling with, it's what is it about the modality of coming into being that is, number one, is so
is so productive as an engine of all forms of ontological violence and systemic institutionalized violence, right? All the above, right? All the above at all different scales. Like, what is it about that, that proliferates all these other layers? So there's the coming into being piece. And then what I'm specifically trying to deal with in this book is a certain moment that I think we're living in where that coming into being is showing the consequences of desegregating its invitation into being, right? Whereas for a long time, white being was for a particular kind of white person, right? It was an classical apartheid logic, right? It's a particular kind of white person, white male, but not exclusively white male, right? But white person. We're in the age of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Like, we're in the hegemony of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I'm grappling with is what does it mean when that civilizational violence, it's ontological, but it's not only ontological, right? It's systemic, it is militarized, it's what I call domestic war, right? It's war. What happens when that modality of coming into being extends an invitation to people who are from the very places, geographies, and populations on which it has waged war for centuries, right? Not for decades, but for centuries, right? And what happens when that invitation is effective and embraced, right? Like, what happens? What does that mean for the way the violence happens? What does that mean for ontology? What does that mean for the way war gets waged and counter warfare, meaning abolitionist struggle, gets waged? That's my dilemma. It's not my dilemma. I would argue it's our dilemma. It's an asymmetrically shared dilemma. In other words, we all inhabit the social text of that dilemma. We just inhabit it in structurally and systemically and politically and ideologically different kinds of ways. But I think that's the condition, I would say.
Well, all right. I think that's a fitting note to sign off on. Thank you so much for doing this. This was awesome. Hopefully it'll elucidate some of your positions and arguments for everybody out there running your critique, which I got to assure you is like a huge chunk of the debate community right now on this topic. And so, have a good evening, everybody, and thanks again.
Right on. I put some info there in the chat, so y'all feel free to reach out. And I haven't been to a college debate in a while, so I'm waiting for an invitation. Invite me, I'll come watch.
All right, sounds good.
All right, you all.
Later.